Okay. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Functional Web Programming in .NET with the Safe Stack. I'm Anthony Brown. If you're looking to heckle anonymously, there's my Twitter or email if you'd like to do that offline. But let's dive right into it. Let's jump straight into functional programming in .NET. So some of you might be aware that on .NET there exist other languages than just C# Visual Basic, one of which is Fsharp. So as a quick introduction to Fsharp, it's a proper functional programming language. It's based on the ML family of languages, so its history is languages like OCaml, so it's got quite a different syntax to C#. It runs on .NET and .NET Core, and it's not brand new. In fact, it's been in development since the early 2000s. When you say functional programming, though, one of the things that people hear with that is maths and finance. And you always get the question of, why would I want to use a functional programming language? All I'm doing is writing web applications, mobile applications, desktop, console, whatever. And they'll always say, isn't Fsharp or FP just for things like maths or finance, etc.? And the answer to that is no. Fsharp is, like C#, a general purpose language. It looks different, you write things in a different way, but ultimately everything runs on the same targets. So we use Fsharp to write things like console applications, mobile applications, desktop apps using it. And in fact, in recent years, we've started to use it to develop all of our web apps. You know, things like functional programming techniques make it easy to do really complex tasks like scalability, whether that's like scalability in terms of users or scalability in terms of development. And so all these people who are skeptical of Fsharp or functional programming always say to us, you know, how do you actually do full stack web development with Fsharp? And so we put our heads together and thought about what it is that we do generally use when we're writing web applications in Fsharp, and we came up with this thing called the Safe Stack, which...
May I ask who we are?
So the question was, who is we? And we is essentially the company that I work for, Compositional IT, and a few other people within the Fsharp community as well. So the Safe Stack is the set of tools, libraries, frameworks that we use that make web development in Fsharp simple and very easy to get to grips with. Taken from the Safe website, Safe is an end-to-end functional first stack for cloud-ready web development that emphasizes type-safe programming, which is a lot of words to say it's a set of tools and libraries that allow you to write web applications from front-end browser-based applications right the way through to back-end solutions that run in the cloud. Within Safe, we've got a few core elements. The first thing is a server-side web application framework. This is, you know, how you host things like your APIs that you're going to be calling, your HTML templating, all of that kind of thing. You also need somewhere to host it and run the thing. So for that, we've also included a hosting environment and platform services. There's also a client-side web application framework. So rather than having to write your front end in JavaScript, you're able to write your front end entirely in Fsharp. And we've also added a UI framework into that as well, because we ultimately want to use idiomatic Fsharp in all of the front-end APIs or in front-end applications that we create. So the Safe Stack is represented by these four things. We've got Saturn and Giraffe, which is our back-end web application server. We've got Azure or AWS. We primarily use Azure, but a lot of other people within the Fsharp community actually use AWS as their deployment targets. F is Fable, which is an Fsharp to JavaScript compiler, which lets you run your Fsharp code anywhere that JavaScript would run. And E is Elmish, which is a UI framework which allows for creating fully functional UIs, so UIs without mutability. We'll see all these 4 things throughout the talk as we go through. A key thing is we primarily develop on .NET Core for our web applications now, and every aspect of the safe stack runs really nicely on .NET Core. There's no hackery needed to make it work. That means it runs on Windows, Mac, and Linux. I'd historically been using OS X for all my day-to-day development of Fsharp stuff for the past couple of years, but I've now switched over to Windows. We've got people using Linux in the community as well to do all their day-to-day, end-to-end web application development. In terms of tooling, there's Fsharp plugins for Visual Studio 2017, Visual Studio Code, JetBrains Rider. So if you want to write web applications in Fsharp, you're still able to use a lot of the tooling that you're used to. There's even more esoteric tooling as well. If you use things like Vim or Emacs or Sublime Text, there's plugins for those available as well. So why did we come up with these components for SAFe? Well, within compositional IT, we'd been writing web applications, and we'd started to notice a trend in the sort of tools that we were using across all of our projects. And so we wanted to share this experience of how we're writing web applications with Fsharp. A lot of people who are new to Fsharp say, well, I've done Hello World, I've done a few example koans or tutorials, but I don't know how to apply that to broader concepts in the outside world. So we wanted to share these experiences with those people. We also noticed clear overlap with how others in the Fsharp world were writing web apps. There are other people all around Europe and the US who were writing web apps in a similar style. We sat down, we talked to them, and we noticed that they were using the same tool chains, the same sort of libraries, and finding the same sort of results as we were. And Saturn, Azure, Fable, and Elmish actually made quite a nice acronym in the end. So we thought, well, let's get a logo as well. Let's now dive in to the components in a bit more detail. First up, let's look at Backend Services with Saturn. So Saturn is a library which exists within the ASP.NET ecosystem, and we have this thing called Saturn at the top. It's essentially a set of configuration helpers and abstractions over the top of a lot of low-level functional concepts, which help with things like configuration or plumbing all your application together. That sits on top of this library called Giraffe. Giraffe is a way of writing ASP.NET web applications using functional concepts. So if you've used ASP.NET Core already, you'll have likely done things like create a controller which inherits from this class. That's not idiomatic Fsharp. In Fsharp, everything is based on functions, and we want to compose functions together as much as possible. And so that's what Giraffe lets us do. As I mentioned, Giraffe sits on top of ASP.NET, which means you get the entirety of the ASP.NET ecosystem along with it. So if there is some library that you need to use, which is only available within ASP.NET, you're still able to use it within SAFe. So if you need to use something like Active Directory authentication, which is a bit of a pain to get right yourself, there's already the ASP.NET Core middleware that exists for that from Microsoft. And the other advantage of this is it means it still runs on top of Kestrel, the high-performance ASP.NET web server. So you're still able to get all that great performance that the ASP.NET team has put together, but you're able to write it all in Fsharp as well. I mentioned that Saturn provides some abstractions over the top of Giraffe concepts. One of the things it provides is this application computation expression, and we'll see in-depth examples of these over the next few slides. This is where you do things like your app-level configuration and routing. So if you've done any ASP.NET Core, this is the equivalent of your like iWeb host builder and iApplication builder. Then there's this thing called a router, which is your way of routing HTTP requests to actual code within your application. And these are all composable. So you can have routers direct into routers, direct into routers, all the way down the chain. There's also this thing called a pipeline, which is a scope level configuration, so like a router level configuration, and other contextual data. So this includes things like authentication, say, any request that goes through this router needs to be authenticated, adding headers, manipulating headers, status codes, serialization, all these kind of things go in your pipelines. And then you've also got this controller abstraction that Saturn introduces, which is designed to be a high-level abstraction for a lot of CRUD operations. So your create, read, update, delete. These are all handled by Saturn with controllers. Let's take a look at these in a bit more detail. Let's look at configuration to start with. So the configuration of ASP.NET Core Apps is entirely through a computation expression, which means you get this really nice, strongly typed configuration. To have a look at an example, we've got this application computation expression here. This is the same type of thing that is used to do asynchronous workflows in Fsharp or task-based workflows in Fsharp. In this case, though, it's applied to configuration. So we get the opportunity to say easily, the URL that you're going to listen to is this URL. You're going to direct it through this router. You're going to use a memory cache. Everything static is going to go through this public path. Let's configure our serialization for our services. And then we'll use gzip encoding as well to compress everything down. And then it's just a case of a simple run app, and it works. Saturn then has this thing called a router. A router is how Saturn links a URL path to a function that's going to execute anytime that URL gets hit. Routers are strongly typed, even in URL parameters, which can be quite a weird thing to see, and we'll see that in just a second. And as I mentioned before, they're all composable, so you can have a router that directs to a router that directs to a router, all the way down the chain. So here I've got two example routers. In Fsharp, we'll read bottom to top because our dependencies need to be specified first within Fsharp. So let's look at this main router at the bottom first. And for that, we've created a router, and we say anything that comes in on this API Office endpoint, we're going to forward through to our Office router that we defined elsewhere. Alternatively, if we get a GET request on that /foo path, then we'll call that getFoo function. As I mentioned, they're composable, so we've got Office router here that's defined above. We can then say a get / within that router will return all offices, or if we do a getF and then /%s, we'll get it by its distinct ID. Now, if you've got some history in like C or those kind of languages where they do the printf with %-based formatting, then you'll be aware that that %s means a string. So what Saturn does is it says that this function here, this getOfficeById, needs to take a string as its first parameter. If you were to have getOfficeById, take a decimal or an integer or anything else, you'll get a compilation error. And your application won't compile until you either fix getOfficeById to take a string, or until you change your path parameter into a %d for an integer, for example. Sometimes you don't want that low-level router configuration, though. Sometimes you want a bit high level, and that is accessed through this controller abstraction. So this is an abstraction for dealing with object-based resources. So if you think of a router as a means of accessing an individual function, a controller is a way of grouping together functions which operate on a single object. So an object might be a person, or a room, or a meeting. And so it provides abstractions for CRUD operations. And this is fully composable with routers and other controllers as well. So here's an example of a couple of controllers. We'll read from the bottom again upwards. So I've got an Office controller here, which is designed to list all of the offices that you might have in a business's network. We have an index here, and this provides us with the context and lets us list all of the offices. We have a show, which provides us with the context again. So that's the HTTP context that provides everything related to the web request, like the user who's logged in, what headers came through, all those kind of details, as well as an ID. And we can perform specific operations using that ID. We can also use this subcontroller here, which says if we come in at a URL like /office/ID/meetings, we want to redirect down to this meetings controller as well. So in this case, we're passing in the Office ID that we got from the parent, and then we're able to do an index of all the meetings happening within that specific office, or an individual meeting happening within that specific office. So as I say, it's all designed with composability in mind, so you can really group specific parts of your application together nicely and link everything together in a completely type-safe way.
Is subcontroller a Saturn thing?
Is subcontroller a Saturn thing? Yes, it is. So this is part of this controller computation expression. What's that, sorry?
Why not to specify this meetings at point in router? Why?
So why is this not specified in the router? Yeah. This is because this is a child of the Office controller. So it's /office/an Office ID /a meeting /a meeting ID. So it's a child. You end up with this tree-based hierarchy of all your resources. And so if it was in your router, you'd lose out on the Office aspect there. We also have the opportunity to create pipelines within Saturn. So these are composable components which handle every stage of the incoming request. So pipelines operate on both the request and the response and let us do 3 operations. We can either modify the request to do things like add new headers, modify the response to serialize the output, or just drop the request entirely if we had like an authentication failure, for example. And pipelines look like this. Essentially, we've got a pipeline here. We're adding a request ID, which is the ASP.NET Core request ID middleware. And we're setting a header on the response. And now, anytime any request comes in, it'll be passed through this pipeline before being handled and sent back to the client. Because Saturn is built on top of Giraffe, which is on top of ASP.NET Core, it allows us to use all the ASP.NET Core middleware. Also, we can run Saturn wherever we can host ASP.NET Core, which means that if you want to, you can run Saturn on Kestrel, you can run it on Azure Functions, you can run it on AWS Lambda. You've got a lot of opportunities for different hosting mechanisms as well. So Fsharp's great in the backend. I personally really like statically typed languages, which means that I'm not a particular fan of JavaScript, and I've never been very good at it. So Fable is a compiler which allows us to write Fsharp and cross-compile it into JavaScript. Except it doesn't just turn it into JavaScript, it turns it into nice, readable, modern JavaScript. If you've used any JavaScript cross-compilers in the past, they can either just operate isolated on the code, or they can make this real mess of an ecosystem around them. Yes?
Is it Fable because of Babel?
Is it Fable because of Babel? Yes, it is. So by using Fable, we're able to share code. So we can take our types and functions, which exist in our .NET Core API, and also compile them to JavaScript using Fable, and then consume them within our Elmish applications. because of the way that Fable is designed, it is an integral part of the JavaScript ecosystem as well. It doesn't reinvent all the JavaScript tooling, so it integrates with Webpack if you're using Webpack in your day-to-day development. If you want to debug your web applications, you can use React and the Redux dev tools as well. And it allows you to use all the existing JavaScript libraries that are out there. So you just have to create a wrapper over the top, and it's consumable within Fsharp. And you get full typing over the top of it. We now want to be able to do our actual UIs in Fsharp as well. Fsharp allows us to do things like mutability, but it's not the recommended approach. We want to use as much idiomatic Fsharp as possible, and we can achieve that by using this thing called Elmish. Now, in my personal opinion, UI programming is actually really difficult, and it's really easy to make it a lot harder. As far as I'm concerned, any mutability in the UI ends up being a bit of a liability. Like, as soon as you start doing anything like complexity relating to handling async operations and you're trying to work out where this callback is going to end up running, am I going to be running 2 callbacks at once to get web requests, responses in? It just gets to be complicated quickly. You also lose a lot of composability of components, I've found. So doing things like MVVM, it's really easy to think, yes, this is going to be easy to compose, but ultimately you end up building quite specific components, I've found. And there's also this difficulty of, if you're running within a desktop application, manipulating the UI on just one thread and checking, am I on the right thread? Do I need to change threads before I can do anything? And it just gets really complicated. And honestly, I'm not that smart. I would rather do things as easily as possible. So what we want to do is we want to bring some functional programming concepts to the UI, because functional programming is all about making data transformations as simple as possible. So how do we do that within our UI? Well, let's start with an initial UI state, the thing that is the bare minimum for your application to show that works. And what we'll do is we'll render that state out to the UI. We'll see some more concrete examples of this later when I show some of the safe tooling that exists as well. Then, anytime somebody interacts with your UI, what we're going to do is we're going to create an event, and that event is then going to be handled, which creates a new state. And once we've got a new state, we render the new state, and because we're rendering an entirely new application, we don't need to worry about, is this thing going to get interrupted by a callback from a web response that's finished, all these kind of things. So to visualize this, we can see we've got a model. Let's start from the top. We have our existing model, and we're going to render it into the view and send it to the browser. Now, whenever there's a page request or a UI event, we're going to update, create an updated model, and then render it out again. But anytime we also receive an event, we'll bring in our existing model, and we can use that as the basis for what's going to happen next. So let's take a look at an example of how this happens in Elmish. Here's a counter example, which is super simple. We've got our counter, which is just an integer, and we've got 3 commands associated with it. So we can either increment our counter, decrement our counter, or reset the counter. That's our model. It consists of our state and our events or commands. We then have a view. A view takes in 2 things: a model, which is the counter state that I mentioned previously, and this dispatch function. This dispatch function is how we can push new events into the render loop. So I'm going to use this Fsharp view helper library here, which is using React under the hood. And I'm going to render a div with a H1 and a button, and I've got this onClick handler. And anytime somebody clicks the plus button, we're going to dispatch an increment event. Also, we're going to render out our current counter value, and we'll finally have another button for a decrement. Now, we have an initial state. This is the very first thing that we're going to show in our UI. And in this case, our counter is 0. You could make that whatever you wanted. There is nothing stopping you saying your counter starts at 100 or 200 or 1,000,000. It's entirely up to you. It's what makes sense to your application. Then, within the update, we take in two things: the command or event and the current model. So then all we do is we match the command with the three options that are available: increment, decrement, and reset. And we generate a new state based on that. Because this is Fsharp, and because our events are a discriminated union, and this is a pattern match, if at any point we fail to consider, for example, the reset event, we'll get a compiler warning or even a compiler error which says, you've not considered all the options. If you don't consider this, your application might break. And then we return a new state. Yes, quick question.
So, I know that it isn't, but reading that code, counter looks like a variable, and it's not a variable. So what is it?
Counter looks like a variable, but it's not a variable. So what is it? Counter is a value. So it's like a variable, but Fsharp is immutable. Nothing changes. So it's just a fixed value.
And it looks like you are changing it. So you're saying counter equals model.counter plus 1.
Yeah.
And that counter is going somewhere out of this code.
So it looks like we're changing it. What we're actually doing is we're creating an entirely new state, like we're doing here, and then returning that new state out. Because then what happens is we have this program.makeSimple at the bottom, which glues our components together and says, whatever comes out of update goes into view, whatever comes out of view goes into update, and does the cycle for you. Program.run starts it up. And I should also mention that it uses React under the hood. So you get all the React dev tools with it, and you get all the performance that comes with React as well. Elmish isn't just for the web either. You can do console applications in it, WPF, Xamarin Forms, so anything that Xamarin Forms can target. You can create fully immutable applications using Fsharp and Elmish. And as we've just seen, Fable. We also deploy all our safe apps to Azure. We've tried to make it as easy as possible to do one-click deploy and do it right. So it's not right-click deploy within Visual Studio. It's a command line command, so you can integrate it within your CI system, local development process, etc. We've created Azure Resource Manager templates, so you can create easily repeatable deployments for all the components that you need within a safe application. And we include scripts to allow you to deploy from CLI, fake scripts, build server, etc. There's full integration with Azure Platform Services. Because of Fsharp, we're able to use type providers. One of the type providers that's included as part of the safe tooling is the Azure Storage type provider, which provides you type-safe access to data that is stored within Azure Storage. So if you've got a blob in Azure Storage, you're able to access that in a strongly typed manner. Similarly, you can get the same sort of strong typing on top of Azure Tables within Azure Storage. It's also hooked up to App Insights. So as soon as you're running your backend server, you can start pushing events out to Application Insights on Azure. And that also leads to integration from Fable. As I said, we wanted to make it as easy as possible for people to start working with web apps in Fsharp. Yes, there was a question.
Type provider for Cosmos?
Is there a type provider for Cosmos DB? I'm not sure. Can't answer that right now. So, the safe experience. as it stands, I've mentioned 4 components which we use for developing web applications. So the key question is, what does safe actually add? Well, the key thing is, it's a terminology for sharing experiences. As it stands, a lot of the Fsharp ecosystem had existed in a lot of independent silos. You had people doing Fable stuff, you had people doing Elmis stuff, Azure stuff, and back-end web stuff. We wanted to bring those all together, so at conferences, in blog posts, etc., people can say, we're using safe, and everybody knows what components are then involved. That means that it makes it really easy for us to create automated tooling for creating a safe app as well. It also means we can get better end-to-end documentation from .NET New to how do I add some complex feature that spans across the whole stack. And it also gives us better end-to-end tooling, and I'm going to demonstrate the tooling shortly. It also means that we can do really in-depth training and samples. So not just how do I build a web application using this Fsharp component, but how do I build a complete, well-architected Fsharp solution to a web application problem. The first thing we did with that is we realized the problem with the current dev process that a lot of people undertake. Currently, it looks something like the following. You'll start with this change code at the top. You write out a load of code. You click F5, click debug, run, whatever, and it'll compile and build. You'd wait a while whilst that happened. You might go off and get a drink. Comes back, your application starts up, your debug is attached, and you'd hit a breakpoint and start trying to work out what's changed. You'd then change your code, recompile, restart, redebug, etc. It's a process that adds a lot of overhead time and makes it really easy to get distracted as part of the development flow. And so to change that, we've embraced tools like .NET Watch and Webpack that allow for automated reloading of your application as you make changes as you go along. So you make a small change to one line, you only need to change that one line within your application. So it's really quick, and you can see the changes happening in real time. And I'll show that shortly. Another thing is, because we now have this stack of tools, we can add commercial support. A lot of the tooling that exists in the Fsharp world doesn't have the same backing as stuff like ASP.NET does. If you've got a problem with ASP.NET, you can phone up Microsoft and say, it's not working, and they'll help you with your problem. Within the Fsharp world, a lot of the libraries were open source. So this meant that it was difficult for commercial adoption because it was quite a big risk for a lot of companies. There's a few consultancies around the world now who have decided to adopt SAFe and say they'll provide full support for any problems you might have or might encounter during development of web applications using SAFe, which takes a lot of the risk off a lot of new companies looking to adopt it.
It's worth noting though that SAFe still is open source, even though you provide that.
Yes, so SAFe is still completely open source, and I'll show GitHub repos and everything towards the end. Another benefit is we get consistent documentation, which means that we can do end-to-end coverage of functionality across the whole stack. So a lot of components within the web world don't exist in isolation. If you want to do authentication, sure, your back-end changes are important, but it's also important to know what changes on the front end to make it work. By having SAFe, we can say to do end-to-end authentication, you need to do X, Y, and Z. If you want to do end-to-end continuous integration, you need to do A, B, and C. So this allows developers to get up to speed on full-stack features really quickly. And so if you're interested in seeing what that documentation currently looks like, it's on safestack.github.io/docs. The next thing that we came up with was a new safe template to make it easy to go from nothing to something that you can then iterate on and change easily. So to do that, we've got a .NET Core template, which provides a variety of options. You can choose what you want to use for your backend web server. So you can choose to use just or you can choose to use Saturn, or just Giraffe that sits underneath it if you don't feel like you need that configuration level. There's layout options, so you can have either, I don't want any CSS, I just want the bare application. There's this library called Fulma, which some of you might have used Bulma, which is a library like Bootstrap. So it's CSS components to make it easier to develop UI-based within the browser. Fulma is a type-safe way of accessing that. So it provides abstractions for, I want to create a table in Bulma, or a section or container. Or you can choose to use Fulma with one of the Bulma templates that's available as well. If you don't want to use HTTP as your communication mechanism for whatever reason, there's also a library called Fable Remoting, which is essentially kind of similar to RPC, but built on top of HTTP with a lot of easy escape hatches. So if you want to get something up and running quickly, a lot of people in the Fsharp community like using the Fable Remoting library. There's also a variety of different deployment options. So you can either choose, I don't want to deploy this, I want to include my own process later in the future. There's also Docker. So you can just say, I want to deploy this into a Docker container, and it will create all of your Docker files that you need. It'll also add steps to your build process that says, here's where all the files need to be within my Docker container. Or there's also the option to deploy to Azure. This is a really full-featured Azure deployment. So you get resource manager templates. There's also full integration with Azure AD within the build scripts. So you can deploy locally from your machine without having to do things like configure applications within Azure Active Directory. So there's really no barriers to just doing a deployment locally, or even if you want to, in your continuous integration server. I should point out that this is actually already out of date, because last week there was also Google Cloud Platform support moved in. So if you want to deploy onto Kubernetes on GCP, then that's all included as part of the template as well. And you can do deploy Google, and it provides you with all the changes to your build script and all the extra tooling that you need to deploy to GCP. And there's also this ability to specify how you want to handle your JavaScript dependencies. So do you want to use just raw NPM, or would you prefer to use Yon for whatever reason?
Is AWS included?
For that, we recommend using Docker and just taking the Docker container and putting it onto Elastic Container Service. That's tended to be the solution that a lot of people find easiest. Yeah.
When you say .NET template, do you mean sort of command line .NET new?
What do I mean by .NET template? Yes, I mean a .NET command line template. So you can just do .NET new safe. And what you end up with is this fully featured application. I'll show that in just a minute as well. Throughout the .NET new lifecycle, it creates all the required templates that you need. So you'll get a fake script to handle your local development and also your CI server. That can do things like build and run, setting up all of your hot reloading, and it also includes things like deployment as well. So you can do fake build deploy, and it will take your local code and deploy it up to Azure. It also includes things like Docker files as well, which will bundle together all of your Fsharp and Fable together, package it up nicely, put it all in the right folder hierarchy, create all the environment variables that you need, so you can then just do Docker run your container, and it all works straight out of the box. So let's take a look at the .NET new tooling and the template that's available. So if I come to my command line here, it's unfortunately a little bit small, but Essentially, all I've had to do is .NET new safe, and that's created all the files I need, and then I've just done fake build target run. So this is my code base, and if I just open up my web browser, then this is your default safe application that you get created. So this is all coming from a backend web server that's running on ASP.NET Core using the Saturn abstractions. I've got a front-end application where I can click the buttons and the UI changes. One thing that you might have noticed, the eagle-eyed among you might have seen that in the top right corner, Redux DevTools is now enabled. This application, because it's built using Elmish, is able to use the Redux DevTools. So if I click in there, you can see all the changes that have been made within my application. So you can go through the history and say, we've got, this is how the UI has changed and the value in the counter has changed. So at any point, I can say, let's jump back to there. And my UI goes back in time to what happened after that event, which makes debugging really easy because you can just change history and jump forward again, change history, jump forward again, and keep repeating like that until you solve the problem. Yes?
State you use record type for like a property count. Can you use union type?
So the question was, in this example, we've got the state as a record type. Yes, you absolutely can use union types as your state. I'm working on one application at the minute where that's exactly what I need because I've got this complex state machine in my front end. And so all I'm then doing is a pattern match on my discriminated union for state and discriminated union for messaging. So within our application that's now running, this is running from my command line here using fake, which is Fsharp make, the Fsharp build tool that a lot of the community uses. One of the cool things that it includes is this thing called hot module reloading. And I am really hoping that the demo gods are kind to me today because when this works, it's really cool. So just to go back, when the initial state loaded, that counter was at 42. It's now at 45. I don't like this messaging though. I don't want it to say press buttons to manipulate counter. So what I'm going to do is say push buttons to manipulate counter. I'm going to cross my fingers. I'm going to save it. My command line is going to see that I've changed it. It's going to recompile. And if you look there, the text that was there has changed. But what hasn't changed is my current state. So my current state within my application was 47 because I pressed the button a few times. I've changed my application though, and it's automatically reloaded before I'd even change back to my browser. So I can then choose whatever I want to say here, or even just change this again, anywhere, reload, and the application reloads without me having to start from scratch to get back to where I was debugging. So it makes it as easy as possible to get started with Fsharp for web development. Let's pick out a few key things that are included. We've added editor extension support. So if you're brand new to Fsharp and you've never done anything before, we include extension recommendations. So if you pick this up in VS Code, you just need to click this install all, and it'll include the Fsharp plugin. For Visual Studio Code, it'll include the Chrome remote debugger and a couple of other features as well to allow support for things like editor config as well. We include 3 projects. So we have a client, a server, and then we've got some shared code between them. If we look at our shared code, we can share our types across our client and server. And so this is where you'd expand to include things like your contract or any functionality that was common across both components. There's a client application. So this is a full Elmish application. You can see the things that we talked about when we went through Elmish, where we can see our model, our messages, our initial values, which come from a remote server somewhere. We can also see all of our update logic and our view down here as well, with everything hooked up together. On the server side, we've got a simple backend server set up with an API, so you can retrieve your application or retrieve values from your backend server. I mentioned the build script. This deployment is done as a non-deployment, so there's no Azure or anything like that. This is just the raw build script, which lets you do clean, build, and run, which will start the hot module reloading, which works on both the front end and the back end. So I can change something within my server API, that reloads, and my front end will reflect that as well. And because Webpack is quite a complicated thing, we've also included a full Webpack template, so you don't need to worry about setting up how does Fable interact with NPM or anything like that, or anything else within the JavaScript ecosystem. So this includes all of your bundling for Fable. It includes all of the hot module reloading as well. Yeah.
If, let's say, I have some components written like React, JS,
Yeah.
can I somehow reuse it here, or I would need to rewrite them?
Can you use components written in React.js? I'm going to come on to that in a little bit. So I'll cover that in the next section. Right, so that is the safe template. As you can see, it's designed to make it as easy as possible to go from nothing to having an Fsharp web application that you can hack on. But it's not enough to just have that initial how do I get started. It's also important to have that continuous learning of what's the next step along the way. And so for that, there's a few example applications that have been put together by the broader community for the Safe stack. So the first one is the Safe Dojo. This is something that we put together, which is a set of tools, or it's a safe app that's got a lot of gaps within it with a guided instructions document. So you go through and it tells you which bits you need to change and shows the sorts of things that you should be looking at as key parts of the Safe stack. There's also the Safe Bookstore. So this is a much larger application. This includes things like storage, deployment with Docker. It includes full authentication with JWTs. This is sort of reference architecture for how do I start to fit everything together with Safe. And a new one that we've put together in the past few months is Safe Search, which is another larger application. And we're going to come on to this in just a second. But this includes significant integration with a lot of Azure services. As the name may imply, one of those is Azure Search. So these are just designed to show the next step of what should my architecture look like, how should I be developing my applications in Fsharp with Safe. So let's take a look at the Safe Search that I mentioned. I'm just going to call out a few little bits and pieces within this. So this is all available on GitHub. It's not a small project. It's quite big, so it's a bit of stuff to get your teeth into if you're interested in learning more about Safe. But this is an application which lists UK property prices and uses the Azure Search services, it uses Azure Storage, and it also uses things like Google Maps in a React component. So you're able to use existing React components that haven't been written in Fsharp. And this is an example reference of how you can do that. So I just wanted to call out a few little bits that relate to the things that were in the Safe stack, which you can see within this application here. So we've got our view here. This is in our front end. As I say, it's not a small application. You can see by the scroll bar there that there's a few hundred lines of code in this. It's not just a dummy application. There is significant functionality here. And so you're able to see how we do things like work with React to use existing components that might have been created outside of the Fsharp ecosystem.
Sorry, is that one view for the whole app then? You wouldn't split that up into different parts?
Entirely up to how your application works. You can have, so question is this just one view for the whole app, or can you split it up? You can split it up, so you can have multiple pages, and there is an Elmish library to do navigation-based changes. So if you wanted to do a full single-page application, you can say, if it's on hash page 1, show this view. If it's on hash page 2, show this view. This one, though, it's one view. There's also a backend, and so you can see how we use the composability of Saturn to combine together multiple independent features of the application. We've got an API for search, an API for transactions, an API for postcode lookup as well, and we're able to compose those all together from different parts of the application. One other cool thing that I thought I'd mention is the Azure storage type provider that you can use. So if we take a look here, we've just got a simple schema written up for what our table looks like. And we've got a postcodes table, which has got a postcode with a latitude and a longitude. Within the type provider, you specify this JSON file. Your compiler then goes through and looks at this tables.json file and builds up the types automatically for you. There's no code generation or anything like that. What happens is it provides the metadata to the compiler that says, this thing, this postcode, is a string, latitude is a float, longitude is a float. And then what you're able to do is you get this Azure.tables here, so the Azure type there, tables static type on there, and all the tables that are accessible within your Azure subscription are available as types on that Azure.tables type. The next thing is the Safe Dojo that I mentioned. So this is an introductory dojo. If you've got experience with Fsharp, you can finish this within about an hour. If you've got no prior Fsharp experience, it takes about an hour and a half. And this has a full set of steps on here's what you need to do to get up and running with the safe stack of tooling. So that's all available on GitHub. If you're interested in learning more about Safe, I'd recommend following @SafeStack on Twitter. That's where a lot of the new news gets posted. There's also the full GitHub organization for Safe that's got examples of applications like the bookstore. It's got examples of using things like React Native, if you want to use React Native with Safe. There's also all the Safe templates in there. So if you want to go out and add DigitalOcean deployment to the Safe template and contribute that, that would be more than welcomed. Safestack.github.io is a web page where it links to all the documentation and everything like that. I'll give you my information again. If you've got any questions about this that you think of tomorrow or in a week's time, please feel free to email me, Anthony@compositionalit.com, or contact me on Twitter @BruinBrown93. And with that, we've got 5 minutes left, so I'm happy to take some more questions on things that I might not have covered. Yes, one question there.
How complete is Fable? I think I tried it out 1 or 2 years ago, and for example, 2D arrays were not supported.
How complete is Fable? I know a lot of people are running Fable applications in production now, whether it's front-end applications, but I've also spoken to some people who are now running Fable on Node.js to run their entire backend. So they've not been encountering too many problems. There might be the odd thing that comes up. I think the latest one was like there was a minor inconsistency with how GUID.new worked, which has since been updated and fixed. But we're at Fable 2.1 now, so it's been fairly well tested, and it's fairly strong in the production-ready sense. Any more questions? Yeah, one question there.
You touched on Fable remoting.
Yeah.
What would be a reason we want to use that?
What would be a reason to use Fable remoting? If you wanted to just get a proof of concept up and running, really simple. In your shared, you just say, I've got this type. In your backend, you can then say, expose this type. In your front end, you can just say, consume this type. So it's not in the same league as like WCF and those kind of tools. It's designed to be really lightweight and easy to just easily change it if you want, not SOAP and WSDL and everything else that you have to bring in. Yeah, question there?
Do you have an example anywhere of integrating like no-auth integration?
Do we have an integration or an example of integration with OAuth? I'm not 100% sure. Let me get back to you on that. Next question? Yeah.
In this room, you're probably preaching to be converted all the interesting.
Yeah.
If you were going to try and sell this
Yeah.
to an existing development team that knew how to do things in C# and all the rest of the developers who were quite competent, but were not doing functional stuff.
Yeah.
Where would you start trying to convince people to begin to switch towards something like this?
How would I convince people to switch? I'd probably show the amount of less time it takes to write solutions in Fsharp than it takes to write in C#. We've found that it takes about a month, 2 months to get most web apps done in Fsharp in the sense of well-scoped, well-defined projects. A lot of our customers come to us because we'll give them a quote to say we'll do this in 2 months, whereas a lot of others say 6 months. So that's our key benefit. Another key benefit is the amount of stories which exist where people have said, I've deployed this application into production and there were no bugs when it went live. You know, it was a case of I clicked deploy, we handed it over to users, and there was no, why is it all stopped? You know, why is there this bug on IE obscure version? Because you're using things like Fable, which are backed by tools like Babel, you get really consistent results across all browsers. Because you're using tools like Fsharp, you're getting really consistent code across all browsers as well. So you get things like the type safety guarantees with URLs. You get things like the guarantees that you're not going to encounter a case that you haven't considered with things like Elmish. It abstracts away a lot of those simple mistakes that are easy to make when you're in that last kind of throw, or in those last kind of throws of this needs to be deployed today. It's really easy to make a mistake because you've changed one thing somewhere and not considered how it affects one thing on the other side of your application. With Fsharp, because of its type safety, we don't encounter those kind of bugs as much. Yes, another question here.
When you are debugging the client-side code,
Yep.
do you ever drop down to the JavaScript?
Do we ever drop down to the JavaScript when we're debugging the front-end code? The majority of the time when I'm debugging front-end code, I'm probably going to be using something like Chrome or the Firefox debugger. And because Fable generates source maps, I'm debugging Fsharp within the browser. So as an example, if I come into here and go F12 and go debugger, and if I come down to Webpack and go into source client, then I'll add my breakpoint onto the Fsharp directly rather than having to deal with JavaScript.
You can do the same code in VS Code.
You can do the same in Visual Studio Code, yes. Next question, the one here.
You showed interrupting with JavaScript.
Yeah.
How does the type safety handle that? Do you keep type safety across JavaScript? Do you have to write your own type wrappers?
How do you get the type safety within JavaScript? If you're using a React component, what you have to do is write out a discriminated union with all your possible props that you can use. If you've got a TypeScript definition of it, though, there is a tool called ts2fable, where you provide a TypeScript definition file, and it generates a Fable wrapper for you. So that's the easiest way. If you do want to use something really obscure that might be from the IE 6 days that your company is having to embed as a component and nobody knows how it works, then you'll have to do a manual wrapper over the top of that. But Fable provides a lot of helpers that make it as easy to work across that sort of weird dynamic to very static barrier that exists. Any more questions? One question there? Yep.
I see that you mentioned that both Azure and AWS are supported as the A part
Yeah.
Of the stack. I wonder if Suave is also supported alongside Saturn, because I think I've seen a couple of people mention Safe with Suave instead of Saturn. I wonder if support was dropped or something.
Is Suave in Safe as well? We essentially said that Suave is nice, but you don't get that whole ecosystem that you get with Saturn. If you want to use Suave, go for it. It's supported in the template. But ultimately, our recommendation tends to be, because you get Kestrel, because you get the AWS Lambda support, because you get all the ASP.NET Core middleware that already exists, Saturn makes it a lot easier. And Giraffe provides essentially the same API across Suave as you'd get within ASP.NET. So, was there some licensing drama? I can't remember off the top of my head.
At some point they just put something to the license agreement that they decided to switch to Saturn.
Any more questions? We are slightly over at the minute, so.
Is there any helpers for testing, integration testing?
Is there any helpers for testing, especially integration testing? Within Fsharp, there's tools like Canopy, which tend to be the primary way of testing like your full integration within your browser as well.
It's more end-to-end. I mean, it's testing at the HTML level.
Oh, yeah.
Here, as we have basically some guarantee on the correctness,
Yeah.
I was maybe thinking a little bit
Okay.
more, but not unit testing.
Yeah. We tend to just write those kind of things in Expecto. So just create a function that tests your functionality across both, whether it's just a web API call or just use the ASP.NET Core test server if you need to. Any more questions? I think there's one there. Yeah.
I was just wondering what you make of Razor, because that obviously potentially brings a lot of these benefits to sort of Sharp world, and it's kind of coming over the horizon then. So, is that Blazor? Sorry, Blazor.
Blazor. So what do I think of Blazor? I think it's a long way off being like everybody's going to be using it as it stands with it being WebAssembly. I think you still need to bring in an entire .NET runtime to use within the browser, if I'm not mistaken, which I'm sure one day there'll be a solution to that, but it means you get quite a big bundle size as it stands. Like,
which is generally not acceptable on the web anymore. If you compare it to React and
yeah.
stuff, this is running down talking 150 kilobytes.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm really excited for what it's going to do, because hopefully it's going to make it easy to make like nice interop across other languages into the browser. But I think there's a way to go just yet. So I'm not sure. I'm keeping an eye on it because people have done Fsharp tooling. So the Web Sharper people have done a Bolero library, which allows you to use WebAssembly within Web Sharper. With that, I think, should we call it a day? If anybody's got any other questions, then please feel free to grab me and ask, or, as I say, Twitter, email. I'm happy to answer any.